You're listening to Ecto Portal, a journey into the unknown with Anthony Anderson and Verna Wilson.
I hope that you are seated comfortably, with the light turned down and the curtains drawn.
Somebody there?
Hello, and welcome to another journey into the unexplored, the unexplained, the unknown Ecto Portal. I'm Anthony Anderson, your host, and I'm here with my co-host,
Verna Wilson.
And today we have, yes, another episode about a famous witch, but actually the last witch, really. I guess you could clarify that, correct?
She was the last witch to be imprisoned under the British Witchcraft Act of 1735. So she is actually officially known as the last witch to be persecuted, although she wasn't executed, in England.
Well, there you go.
In the UK, yeah.
But she wasn't hung as a witch. She wasn't
hung or executed, no.
Not executed as a
No.
witch, just testified and on trial as a witch.
Right. So this was before the repeal of the law of 1735. And let me go ahead and read a little bit about that repeal so that people can understand what it is.
Should we wait till we get to that? Or do you want to do the repeal first?
Let's do the repeal first.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go for it.
The Witchcraft Act of 1735, it was an act that was passed by the Parliament of the Kingdom of Great Britain in 1735, which made it a crime for a person to claim that any human being that had magical powers or was guilty of practicing witchcraft. And with this, the law abolished the hunting and executions of witches in Great Britain. The maximum penalty set out for this act was a year imprisonment. So an act to repeal the statute made in the first year of the reign of King James the First was an act against conjuration, witchcraft, and dealing with evil and wicked spirits. And it was so much, except that so much thereof as repeals an act of the fifth year of the reign of Queen Elizabeth against conjurations, enchantments, and witchcrafts, and to repeal and an act passed in Parliament in Scotland in the ninth year of the Parliament of Queen Mary, which meant that it was for punishing such persons as pretend to exercise any kind of witchcraft, sorcery, or conjuration. So any time you were a medium, if you were caught in it, they use that act to persecute you.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm not gonna go into it for too long, but that's basically what it was.
So essentially that act has still, up until this particular story, had been in like a century, right? It had been created a century before this story happened.
It was created a couple of centuries, actually.
You're right.
Yeah, a couple of centuries, and many people practiced, and they were even well known as witches or sorcerers before that, but they didn't get caught because they were careful. So we'll explain why she got caught.
Exactly.
Yeah. So Victoria Helen Duncan, she was born in November 1897, and she died in December 6, 1956. She was a Scottish medium, and of course she was best known as the last person to be imprisoned under the British Witchcraft Act of 1735. She was famous for producing ectoplasm made from cheesecloth. And she was born in Callander, Perthshire on the 25th of November, 1897. She was the daughter of Archibald McFarlane and Isabella Rattray. At school, she alarmed her fellow pupils with her prophecies and hysterical behavior, to the distress of her mother, who was a member of the Presbyterian Church. And after leaving school, she worked at Dundee Royal Infirmary, and in 1916, she married Henry Duncan, who was a cabinet maker and a wounded war veteran who was supportive of her supernatural talents. He was supportive of her as a medium. And she was a mother of 6, and she also worked part-time in a bleach factory.
Yikes.
So, yeah, a bleach factory. That's kind of scary. But she led a normal life, pretty much. And even though she had these hysterical moments where she was a clairvoyant and she would go on about stuff.
So her mom wasn't so crazy about it, but her dad was supportive.
Well, actually, her husband was supportive of it. Yeah, her husband was supportive of it. They don't say what her dad felt, but her mother wasn't very happy about it because her mother was very much a churchgoer. And, in Scotland...
Daughter.
yeah, exactly. But, I'm going to kind of... and you've been to Scotland. In Scotland, stuff like that is actually taken a little more seriously because there's a long history, and people have a history of mediumship over there.
Yep.
So she probably knew that her daughter had mediumship powers, but of course she didn't care for it. So, but anyway, in 1926, she developed from clairvoyant to medium by offering seances in which she claimed to summon the spirits of recently deceased people by emitting ectoplasm from her mouth. I never see mediums do that today.
I do that all the time. Ectoplasm from my mouth. I can't get it.
Is that why we're called ectoportal?
Yeah, because here comes again. No, sorry. Keep going.
Oh, very funny. Don't believe him, folks. Okay, so in 1928, the photographer Harvey Metcalf, he attended a series of seances at the house of Helen Duncan's. And during the seance, he took various flash photographs of her and her alleged materialization spirits, including her spirit guide, Peggy. The photographs that were taken, they revealed the spirits to be fraudulently produced, and there was a doll made from a paper mache and a mask draped in an old sheet. I don't know how she thought she can get away with that.
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he attended enough of them.
Yeah.
So anyway, in 1931, the London Spiritualist Alliance examined her method, and another exam of pieces of ectoplasm revealed that it was made of cheesecloth paper mixed with the white of egg and laboratory paper stuck together. One of her tricks was to swallow and regurgitate some of her ectoplasm, and she was persuaded to swallow a tablet of methylene blue before one of her seances by the SLA committee to rule out any chance of this trick being performed. And because of this, no ectoplasm appeared. The committee in a report concluded that the material was swallowed by Mrs. Duncan at some time previous to being sitting, and regurgitated by her for the purpose of exhibiting ectoplasm. And I don't know, how did they find out she swallowed ahead of time? Did they see her do it?
I don't know. I know the blue must be so that...
They recognized it?
Well, I think anything... The reason they say that it must have been consumed ahead of time is the pill would be digested after the fact that she already swallowed some earlier, so it wouldn't be blue. But the whole point of doing the pill is that if she did try and swallow something after the pill, it would come out blue, and they knew that she was fake. Do you understand what I'm saying?
No, I do understand what you're saying, but I'm just wondering how they knew she swallowed it ahead of time. Did they see it, is what I'm wondering.
Well, no, that's the whole point, is they want to ensure that she didn't swallow it ahead of time.
Okay. And isn't it interesting that there was a Spiritualist Alliance before this witchcraft repeal, so they were very careful, too.
I would actually like to dig more about them.
I would, too.
Maybe even do a separate show about that alliance.
Yeah, that actually, they interest me, too.
I've never heard of that before.
I've never heard of them either.
Interesting.
So anyway, a piece of ectoplasm was from one of her early seances was obtained and secured in a bottle of distilled water, and it was given to a psychical researcher, Harry Price,
we know well.
Yeah, who was a director of the National Laboratory of Psychical Research, and he was very excited about the sample, and how when he gave the sample to a chemist for analysis, it was discovered to be egg white mixed with chemicals. And he later duplicated her ectoplasm with similar substances. So he wanted to show that it was possible. So in 1931, Price paid Helen Duncan £50 to perform a number of test seances. She was suspected of swallowing cheesecloth, which was then regurgitated as ectoplasm. And Price had proven through analysis a sample of ectoplasm produced by Duncan that it was made of cheesecloth. She reacted violently at attempts to x-ray her, running from the laboratory and making a scene in the street where her husband had to restrain her, destroying the controlled nature of the test. And according to Price, in a report of the mediumship of Duncan, at the conclusion of the fourth seance, we led the medium to a settee and called for the apparatus. At the sight of it, the lady promptly went into a trance. She recovered but refused to be x-rayed. Her husband went up to her and told her it was painless. She jumped up and gave him a smashing blow on the face, which sent him reeling. Then she went for Dr. William, who was present. He dodged the blow. Mrs. Duncan, without the slightest warning, dashed out into the street, had an attack of hysteria, and began to tear her seance garment to pieces. She clutched the railings and screamed and screamed. Her husband tried to pacify her. It was useless. I leave the reader to visualize the scene. A 17-stone woman clad in black satin tights locked to the railing, screaming at the top of her voice. A crowd collected and the police arrived. The medical men with us examined the position and prevented them from fetching the ambulance. We got her into the laboratory, and at once she demanded to be x-rayed. In reply, Dr. William Brown turned to Mr. Duncan and asked him to turn out his pockets. He refused and would not allow us to search him. There was no question that his wife had passed the cheesecloth in the street.
To him, right?
Right. However, they gave us another seance, and the control said that we could cut off a piece of teleplasm. I never heard of teleplasm.
I've never heard of that. That's interesting.
When it appeared, the sight of a half a dozen men with each of a pair of scissors waiting for the word was amusing. It came, and we all jumped. One of the doctors got a hold of the stuff and secured a piece. The medium screamed, and the rest of the teleplasm went down her throat. This time it wasn't cheesecloth. It proved to be paper soaked in white of egg and folded into a flattened tube. Could anything be more infantile than a group of grown-up men wasting time, money, and energy on the antics of a fat female crook?
Ouch.
That's brutal.
That's very brutal. That's dead honest from Price, I guess.
I would have walked away. I would have said, you know what? This is BS.
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
Price in his report published photographs of Duncan in his laboratory that revealed fake ectoplasm made from cheesecloth, rubber gloves, and cut-out heads of magazine covers, which she pretended to her audiences were spirits. Psychologist William McDougall, who attended 2 of the seances, pronounced her whole performance fraudulent in an appendix to the actual report. Now, following the report written by Price, Duncan's former maid, Mary McGinley, confessed in detail to having aided Duncan in her mediumship tricks, and Duncan's husband admitted that the ectoplasm materializations were the result of regurgitation. And in a seance on January 6, 1933 in Edinburgh, a little girl called Peggy emerged in a seance room. A sitter named Esson Mall grabbed her, and the lights turned on, and the spirit was revealed to be made from a stocking net undervest. The police were called, and Duncan was prosecuted and fined £10. The undervest was used as evidence, which led to Duncan's conviction of fraudulent mediumship at the Edinburgh Sheriff Court trial on May 11, 1933. The Spiritualist journal Light endorsed the court decision that Duncan was fraudulent and supported Price's investigation that revealed her ectoplasm was cheesecloth. Now, Duncan's husband was also suspected of acting as her accomplice by hiding her fake ectoplasm. Now, Duncan frequently had nosebleeds during seances. William Brown suggested that this was another of Duncan's hiding places for her fake ectoplasm. In 1936, psychical researcher Nandor Fodor offered money to Duncan if she would be filmed with an infrared camera during a seance. She refused.
During World War II, in November 1941, Duncan held a seance in Portsmouth at which she claimed the spirit materialization of a sailor told her that HMS Barnum had been sunk. Because the sinking of HMS Barnum was revealed in strict confidence only to the relatives of casualties and not announced to the public until late January 1942, the Navy started to take an interest in her activities. 2 lieutenants were among her audience at a seance on the 14th of January, 1944. One of these was a Lieutenant Worth, who was not impressed as a white cloth figure had appeared behind the curtains claiming to be his aunt. But he had no deceased aunt. So in the same sitting, another figure appeared claiming to be his sister, but Worth replied that his sister was alive and well.
Oops.
Worth was disgusted by the seance and reported it to the police. This was followed up on the 19th of January when undercover policemen arrested her at another seance as a white shrouded manifestation appeared. This proved to be Duncan herself in a white cloth in which she attempted to conceal when discovered and when she was arrested.
Researcher Graham Donald wrote that Duncan could have easily found out about the HMS Barham, and she had no genuine psychic powers, according to Donald. The loss of the HMS Barham, torpedoed off the coast of Egypt on November 25th, 1941, was indeed kept quiet for a while, but letters of condolence were sent out to the families of the 861 dead, asking them to keep the secret until the official announcement. So, allowing for perhaps 10 people in each family, there were about 9,000 people who knew of the sinking. In each of them told only one other person, there were about 20,000 people in the country aware of the sinking, and so on. Hardly a closely guarded secret. In short, news of the sinking spread like wildfire. Duncan simply picked up on the gossip and decided to turn it into profit. A leak concerning HMS Barham was later discovered. A secretary of the First Lord had been indiscreet to Professor Michael Poston of the Ministry of Economic Warfare. Poston had said that he believed he had been told officially and was not arrested. Now, Duncan was found to be in the possession of a mocked-up HMS Barham hat band. This apparently related to an alleged manifestation of the spirit of a dead sailor on the HMS Barham. Although Duncan apparently did not know that after 1939, sailors' hat bands carried only HMS and did not identify their ships.
I give up on her.
She was initially arrested under Section 4 of the Vagrancy Act of 1824, a minor offense tried by magistrates. The authorities regarded the case as more serious and eventually discovered Section 4 of the Witchcraft Act 1735, covering fraudulent spiritual activity, which was triable before a jury. Now charged alongside her for conspiracy to contravene this act were Ernest and Elizabeth Homer, who operated the Psychic Center in Portsmouth, and Frances Brown, who was Duncan's agent and went with her to set up seances.
Didn't she warn her?
There were 7 courts, 2 of the conspiracy to contravene the Witchcraft Act, 2 of obtaining money by false pretenses, and 3 of the common law offense of public mischief. The prosecution may be explained by the mood of suspicion prevailing at the time. The authorities were afraid that she would continue to reveal classified information, whatever her source was. They were also concerned that she was exploiting the recently bereaved, as the recorder noted when passing sentence.
Duncan's trial for fraudulent witchcraft was a minor cause celebre in wartime London. Alfred Dodd, a historian and senior Freemason, testified that he was convinced she was authentic. The trial was complicated by the fact that a police raid on the seance in Portsmouth, leading to the arrest of Helen Duncan, yielded no physical evidence of the fraudulent use of cheesecloth and was therefore based entirely on witness testimony, the majority of which denied any wrongdoing. Duncan was barred by the judge from demonstrating her alleged powers as part of her defense against being fraudulent. The jury brought in a guilty verdict on count 1, and the judge then discharged them from giving verdicts on the other counts, as he held that they were alternative offenses for which Duncan might have been convicted had the jury acquitted her on the first count. Duncan was imprisoned for 9 months, Brown for 4 months, and the Homers were bound over. After the verdict, Winston Churchill wrote a memo to Home Secretary Herbert Morrison complaining about the misuse of court resources on the obsolete tomfoolery of the charge. So actually, he was on her side as far as.
Now it sounds to me by that statement that he's disgusted that they wasted the people's taxpayers' money on this stupid
That would
trial.
make sense. Yeah.
Like, why are we even bothering with this charlatan?
Right. So in 1944, Duncan was one of the last people convicted under the Witchcraft Act in 1735, which made falsely claiming to procure spirits a crime. She was sentenced to 9 months. When convicted, she cried out, "I have done nothing. Is there a God?" On her release in 1945, Duncan promised to stop conducting seances, but she was arrested during another one in 1956. She died at her home in Edinburgh a short time later. Duncan's trial almost certainly contributed to the repeal of the Witchcraft Act, which was contained in the Fraudulent Mediums Act 1951, promoted by Walter Monslow, Labour Member of Parliament for Borough and Furness. The campaign to repeal the act had largely been led by Thomas Brooks, another Labour MP who was a spiritualist. Duncan's original conviction still stood, and it was the subject of a sustained campaign to have it overturned.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Contrary to what spiritualists have written, there was nothing strange or unusual about the death of Duncan. It was not caused by her trance being disturbed by the police. Duncan's medical records showed that she had a long history of ill health, and as early as 1944, she was described as an obese woman who could only move slowly as she suffered from heart trouble. After her death, Duncan was cited in paranormal and parapsychological books as an example of a fraudulent medium. However, she retained supporters amongst the spiritualist community on this. Jenny Hazelgrove has noted, her opponents condemned her mediumship out of hand, while her supporters took up the opposite position. Any suspicious aspects of the Duncan mediumship, the wood pulp ectoplasm, the ectoplasmic drapery that resembled cheesecloth, were glossed over by the followers in the interest of producing a wholly idealized picture of her life and mediumship. The psychical researchers, Simeon Edmonds, also noted that spiritualists have a history of ignoring the evidence of fraud in the Duncan case. He criticized the spiritualist press, such as Psychic News, for biased reporting and distorting facts. Science writer Mary Roach, in her book Spook, Science Tackles the Afterlife, 2007, favorably mentioned Price's methods in debunking Duncan as a fraudulent medium. Richard Denham's book, Weird War II, focuses on the absurdity of Duncan being charged and convicted as a witch in the paranoia of wartime Britain, particularly the frustration of Winston Churchill, who himself had been ordained into the ancient order of the Druids. Now inspired by her legacy, a new wave of British heavy metal band Seventh Son recorded and released a song, The Last Witch, in England in 2009, depicting her life and her prediction of the sinking of the HMS Barham. The naval investigation and subsequent trial was dramatized as a radio play, The Last Witch Trial, by Melissa Murray, starring Joanna Monroe as Duncan and Indira Varma as the undercover agent investigator, who was broadcast by BBC Radio 4 June in 2010.
I'm surprised a movie hasn't been made about this.
Actually, I am too. Descendants and supporters of Duncan have campaigned on several occasions to have her posthumously pardoned of witchcraft charges. Petitions for posthumous pardon were rejected by the Scottish Parliament in 2001, 2008, and 2012. Duncan supporters maintain a website and an online petition where they continue to campaign for her pardon.
I also heard that they put a statue of her in the town where she was born, as a monument for her.
All right. So, what do you think of Helen Duncan? Do you think she's a legit medium?
I do.
Do you?
Yeah, I do.
You just said you gave up on her while we were going over the story.
It doesn't mean that I thought what she did was right, though. See, she was a legit medium. She had bouts of mediumship growing up, and she was known as a medium, and she probably didn't know what to do with her powers, because when you have that kind of mediumship and you're growing up and you don't know what to do with it, it can make you, I don't want to say crazy, but it can definitely it can definitely have an effect on you. So she probably knew she had powers, and she was probably attempting to display them, but she went about it the wrong way. If you keep doing stuff like throwing up and trying to do things for effect, people are going to want to know whether you're fake or what's going on. She could have done the readings without having to do any of those effects, and she probably could have made money too based on real readings. And also, when you're doing this during wartime, you got to be so freaking careful. She was sabotaging herself, is what she was doing.
Okay, let me ask you this.
Okay.
The only way you're going to be able to tell if you're a real medium is if you're trying to determine that under normal medium circumstances.
Right.
She refused to do any of that the entire time.
That's right. That's what I said. She was sabotaging herself.
Therefore, how can you come to the conclusion that she's a real medium if she refuses to allow anyone to actually prove that?
Well, because I think that
Think of all the tests they did on her. And she
right.
refused, like the infrared test. She refused to do that.
Right. So she was refusing to do all of that stuff because she knew that they would find out she was faking a lot of her effects.
Mm-hmm.
But she was. But okay. I really don't have proof she's a real medium. But in school, if she was predicting stuff, and she was having these visions, and she was not knowing what to do with it, and I mean, I don't think she should have gone crazy and gone hysterical. That's kind of a little bit off balance there.
I was just going to bring that up since you brought it up now.
Yeah.
I don't think that was a crazy hysterical fit. I think the only reason that happened is because she was forced up against the wall, and she could not produce what they wanted. And you know what? The best way to get out of that is to suddenly have a hysterical fit, run from the building, tear at your clothes.
Oh, no, later on. No, later on. I agree with you.
Yeah.
No, later on. She
that just looked like a
she spoiled it.
That looked like a really blatant attempt to let me divert because I can't produce.
No, I agree with that. She spoiled it. She sabotaged herself. I mean, people are going to think she's a fake, and nobody's going to want to work with her after that. And that husband, I don't know how he put up with that, the slapping him on the face.
The husband was in on it, the maid was in on it, the agent was in on it,
but
the neighbors were in on it that were helping.
Okay, but her family knew that she actually did have mediumship powers. Her family knew about it, and growing up, she was known for it.
Yeah.
So if she had them and she didn't know what to do with them, but she took advantage of them later, she could have had them and she could have put them to good use, is what I'm trying to say. But she sabotaged herself. And then if you're going to exploit stuff during wartime, of course they're going to get suspicious of you, and you're going to sabotage yourself.
Yeah, especially if you're giving information about ships that were sunk that nobody released.
They had to be so careful back then.
But I think we've discussed this before, where a medium started out with some true ability,
right,
and slowly went into the corruption of performing for money or fame,
right,
and they get addicted to that, and their agent gets addicted to that, and everyone around them gets addicted to that.
So
and
they're
realize
expected.
If we don't continue these amazing feats as a medium, we can no longer live the way we're living, and she'll no longer be famous. We'll no longer be able to do this. So in a way, all of them are probably like, we know we're kind of faking some stuff, but you know what? She does have abilities. Let's keep going. And I think it snowballs. I think they get so addicted to that. Look at the amazing things she can do, that soon having all these tricks and like wearing the white cloth and the headband of the ship, HMS.
Yeah. I
think they somehow justify them as they go along. And then when someone sits down and tries to really critique her, like, are you a medium? They're like, this is all a sham. This is a sham. That's a sham.
Because these were real associations and real real people who actually supported that kind of thing, these spiritualist and psychical associations.
Well, I think nowadays a lot of these societies and even spiritualists do support her and think she was legit. Now, whether they agree that she's legit, but she also was a charlatan and a fraud, because she was both.
Right, that's how I feel. Yeah,
I don't think spiritualists would agree with that. I think, she was always a legit. They just, mocked her and didn't actually really look at the evidence, because they're saying every time there was ectoplasm that came from her, nobody really looked closely at it. Well, that's not true, because Harry Price had it actually examined in a lab.
Right,
that it was egg whites, and he figured out everything she used.
They ignored that part.
Yeah.
So her family's trying to stand up for her. A lot of spiritualists and clairvoyants and psychics these days are trying to stand up for her. Mm-hmm. I'm standing up for her in a way, because I know when you're growing up and you have visions and stuff you don't know what to do with, it's hard to take that. But taking advantage of the gift that you have and using it, and then turning into a hysterical woman who doesn't even want to get tested, you're sabotaging yourself, and they're ignoring that part. And they're ignoring the part that, like you said, some material actually got tested by some people.
But think about when you were reading about her abilities when she began. It was visions, that she didn't understand.
Right.
She could give information that before it happened, or things that happened, that kind of thing. Versus during spiritualism at the time, it was popular to have a seance. It was popular to contact your dead relatives.
Right.
To have visions, to have ectoplasm, to have moving chairs, to have...
All the effects.
Rather than hone in on what she had the abilities for, she instead kind of threw them aside and said, well, let's do the parlor tricks because it's the spiritualist era.
I think that's where a lot of mediums at the time went wrong. Take, for example...
The Fox sisters.
I was about to say the Fox sisters. To me, in my humble opinion, if these mediums who really did have some true abilities were able to stick with just the mediumship, they would have had a much more interesting career. Much more. Without the parlor tricks, because they would have been... I mean, their reputation would have grew... And I think, and as you and I know, that when you're intuitive and your intuitive abilities come out, you learn to work with them and you learn to feel them better. So, but
I think there's so much pressure at the time because spiritualism was so huge after World War I.
Yeah.
Before and after the Civil War and after World War I, and then just before you're going into World War II, it was still huge.
Of course, it was.
So the pressure on her was, well, in order to get somewhere, to people take notice, I have to start incorporating some of these spiritualist movements, techniques, tricks, parlor tricks.
But there were many spiritualists who led a long career that didn't do that.
They didn't have to do that.
They didn't have to do it, right.
What's kind of sad about Helen is it would have been more interesting to see how she would have developed what she had versus let me replace it with something else that appeases other people. Do you know what I mean?
I agree with you. And I think if she were to do this today, a lot of, we know a lot, you and I know a lot of spiritualists, we know a lot of mediums, we know a lot of people who actually do practice this stuff because of the nature of our show and what we do. And she would be dismissed right away. Well, they wouldn't even.
Today, I think cold readers are the parlor tricks of the Victorian era, but today's version of that.
Yeah.
That's what I think cold readers are. They're the ones that are having table tipping and ectoplasm gauze coming out of their mouth.
I agree.
Trumpets.
and folks, if you're listening to this for the first time about cold reading, actually Anthony and I did a show on cold reading before.
It was interesting.
It was very interesting, and one of these times we're going to publish that show, and you'll be able to listen to it, and you'll be able to find out how cold readings are conducted and what they're like. And I actually was demonstrating what a cold reading was like, and I ended up not doing a cold reading, but you'll hear the show.
It was an interesting show, though.
Very interesting, yeah. So the cold readers today are the parlor tricks from yesterday, but I would be actually very interested in a spiritualist these days, or modern spiritualists, doing the parlor tricks from yesterday to see what they're like. I would be interested to see if they could try to perform them.
Produce that,
just to see what it's like. To try to produce the real thing and see what it's like and see if they could actually do it. I've heard that a lot of the spiritualist churches around the country, and I've heard that some of the old seances in Lily Dale actually tries to redo those, the historical seances.
But are you redoing them to redo them, or are you redoing them to see if people would think, maybe that there was something to it versus...
I think a little bit of both, maybe. Well, I can't speak for Lily.
I think people are really skeptical now, so if you did that... Are you doing them to prove that... You'd have to ask yourself why you're doing it. Are you doing it to prove that it was real, or are you doing it to prove that it was fake? Do you know what I'm saying?
Right. And I can't answer for Lily Dale. I can't answer for any modern spiritualists. But if they're doing it to show how it was actually done and how it could actually produce the real spirit energy, that's great. If they're doing it just to show what it was like, I'd be interested in that too. As long as they tell people ahead of time, this may not actually produce anything real, we're just showing you what they did and what it was like. I would be interested in both types of demonstrations.
The experience of what would have occurred at a seance, a sitting.
Right. So if any spiritualists listening to this or anybody from Lily Dale would like to talk to us about that and talk about these so-called, I wouldn't want to call them entirely parlor tricks, but these so-called effects that mediums used to use, I'd like to hear more about it and how it can generally be used to bring about spirit.
I mean, whether you believe it or not, I think it would be fascinating to see people recreate these.
Right.
And have an entire seance recreated from the beginning to the end on how it would have been back then.
Right, using the trumpet, using ectoplasm, which is of course what we
Table
based
rising.
table rising, which is of course what we based our show's name on, ectoportal, ectoplasm.
Yep.
So I feel very bad that Helen actually probably could have had a great career. Her gifts could have been done so much good if she really had them. But she sabotaged herself, and
I think the Fox sisters did the same thing. I think they threw it away for the same. I think they got addicted to that spiritualism gravy train.
Yeah, and people looked at her as a joke after a while. So it's when I said, "Oh, I give up on you," because I kept seeing her sabotaging herself. It's like, here she goes again.
Yep.
She should have learned from maybe the first or second time. So, but anyway, good luck to her relatives who are standing up for her. If there's something they know that we don't, I'm interested in hearing more. She sounds like she could have been an interesting woman if you really got to know her. But all we hear is the silly side, and that's kind of sad that that's what we're left with.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting of Harry Price, because we've mentioned Harry Price in a number of episodes, because he comes up now and then because he was part of the Psychical Research Society.
Right. Mm-hmm.
We're gonna have to do an entire show, I think, on
Harry Price. That would be good.
We haven't done that yet, so we might want to do that in the future.
Good. Yeah, that would be a good subject. And then there's some of these associations I'd like to hear more about.
Yeah, that one in the beginning. What was it? The mediumship. What was that?
Let me go ahead.
It was the very, very beginning.
It was the Spiritualist Association, the one in the beginning. Anyway, I have to.
I had never heard of that.
Let's see. Let me go into that. Let me just hold on, folks. I'm gonna look it up really quickly. It is the London Spiritualist Alliance.
Yeah, I'd like to learn more about that
because I have never heard of that.
Maybe they still exist. Maybe we can get them on the show.
That would be great. We should contact their office and tell them if they'd like to come on. Yeah,
that'd be awesome.
Yep.
All right, folks. That's another episode for this week on Ecto Portal. And I guess until next week, we'll say goodbye.
Bye. See you next week.
Royalty-free, copyright-free music by Ross Bugden.